Imagine that you are a decision maker in a Finnish municipality and you're responsible for choosing between 4 alternative programs for improving certain traffic infrastructure. These programs have different impacts when it comes to municipality tax, drive time through the infrastructure, road fatalities, and CO2 emissions. Which one of these programs would you choose? Program A, low tax essentials, that yields no tax increase, but also makes only moderate improvements to the system. Program B, safety first streets, which yields a moderate tax increase, but significantly decreases road fatalities. Program C, transit and climate push, which yields a relatively high tax increase, but also cuts the CO2 emissions quite considerably. Or Program D, car-centric relief, which significantly decreases drive time, but also increases both road fatalities and CO2 emissions. Making these kinds of multi-objective decisions can be difficult, particularly when some of the objectives are related to what's called sacred values, related to, for instance, health, safety, the environment, or even cultural identity. In our example, the objectives related to road fatalities and CO2 emissions can be considered as sacred, while the objectives related to taxes and drive time can be considered as secular. Now, these sacred objectives are particularly difficult when we have scarce resources, so that trade-offs need to be made. Improving performance on a secular objective at the cost of deteriorating performance on a sacred objective is called a taboo trade-off. Trading off 2 sacred values against one another is called a tragic trade-off. In our critical or transportation infrastructure example, for instance, choosing Program D, car-centric relief, would imply making a taboo trade-off. Here you would be essentially accepting an increase in both road fatalities and CO2 emissions in order to decrease drive time. Likewise, if you were to choose Program A over either B or C, you would be making a taboo trade-off. Here, a relatively higher level of road fatalities and CO2 emissions would be justified by the avoidance of a tax increase. On the other hand, choosing between B and C requires you to make a tragic trade-off. What decrease in CO2 emissions would justify the relatively higher level of road fatalities? Now, according to our recent survey with decision analysis professionals, people find it more difficult to make taboo and tragic trade-offs compared to settings where you only have secular objectives. Tragic trade-offs in particular are both emotionally and cognitively more difficult, while taboo trade-offs can cause outrage and people not being willing to respond to preference elicitation questions. So one can say that when objectives are sacred, making value judgments between them is the hardest. But it is exactly in these kinds of settings where such value judgments would be the most essential. So the question is how to support difficult decisions involving tragic and taboo trade-offs. I suggest that 4 important viewpoints should be taken into account. First, clear definitions. Second, guardrails on sacred objectives. Third, systematic preference elicitation methods. And fourth, sensitivity analysis. Value trees offer a systematic tool for defining one's objectives and the attributes for measuring the attainment of these objectives. These kinds of clear definitions help us replace vague statements such as environmental sustainability is more important than cost by explicit value judgments between measurable attributes. Clear attribute definitions also make it possible to set guardrails on sacred objectives. For instance, in the traffic infrastructure example, one could say that no increase in road fatalities is acceptable. And this would rule out program D from further consideration. After unacceptable alternatives have been ruled out, structured preference elicitation methods can be used to prioritize between the remaining alternatives. And by preference elicitation, I mean basically questions posed to the decision maker or decision makers to gain an understanding about their preferences, both within and between different attributes. So this process begins with the definition of attribute-specific value functions or utility functions. So here, one first associates the worst and best performance levels on a given attribute with values of 0 and 100 respectively. For the CO2 emissions attribute, for instance, the worst performance level could be no decrease in CO2 emissions, that is a performance level of 0, and the best case could be minus 30 kilotons per year. So after this, we are posing these kinds of questions to the decision maker. Current CO2 emissions from traffic within the infrastructure are 150 kilotons per year. At what number X would the improvement from 150 to X feel just as valuable to you as the improvement from X further down to 120 kilotons per year? The decision maker could respond something like, okay, a decrease from 150 to 140 is equally valuable to me as a further decrease from 140 down to 120. And these changes would be equivalent to delta values of minus 10 and minus 30. So this would tell us that the value at minus 10 is 50, which is exactly half of the value of 100 associated with the jump from the worst to the best performance level. So this process is then repeated to get additional points for the value function. So the performance levels associated with values of 25 and 75. And then to get the points in between, the elicited points, we can use methods such as linear interpolation. And this process is repeated to all of the attributes. So in this case, for our example decision maker, the value functions for both road fatalities and drive time are linear. And this implies that in both attributes, a unit decrease is equally valuable regardless of the starting point. Now, what's nice about these value functions is that you can use them to bring the attributes to a common scale between 0 and 100. That is, you can take the performance matrix, which contains the alternatives attribute-specific performances, and translate it into a value matrix that contains the alternatives value attribute-specific value scores. And this value matrix clearly highlights those attributes on which an alternative performs well and those on which it performs poorly. The next step in preference elicitation is the determination of trade-off weights. Here one can use explicit methods, which are basically direct trade-off questions between performance levels on two attributes. So these are questions such as, what is the maximum tax increase that you would be willing to accept to decrease the emissions by 20 kilotons per year? One can also use implicit methods in which the decision maker makes pairwise choices between multi-attribute decision alternatives, such as programs A and B here. And then the weights are inferred from various of these kinds of pairwise choices. Now, these implicit methods, I don't know if that's how you feel, but they might be cognitively a little bit easier than the explicit methods. But on the other hand, you also have to pose many more preference elicitation questions in the implicit methods to get the weights. So, what these preference elicitation questions do is they help us identify equally preferred changes in the attributes. So for this example decision maker, foregoing a tax increase of 0.25 percentage points is equally valuable as increasing drive time by only 1 minute instead of 2, which is equally valuable with cutting CO2 emissions by 6 kilotons per year, which finally is equally valuable with decreasing road fatalities by 0.1 per year. And these equally preferred changes can be used to compute attribute weights. And here they would be 5% for taxes, 11% for drive time, 67% for road fatalities, and 17% for CO2 emissions. The correct interpretation for an attribute weight is the relative value of changing this attribute from its worst to its best performance level. And this interpretation helps us really make the value judgments between the attributes quite explicit. So instead of saying that CO2 emissions are less important than road fatalities, we're saying that decreasing road fatalities by 1.2 per year is 4 times as valuable as decreasing CO2 emissions by 30 kilotons per year. So now, finally, we have the value matrix and we have the weights, and then we can compute the overall values for our decision alternatives. And basically, the overall value is just the weighted sum of the alternatives' attribute-specific value scores. In this case, alternative B, safety first streets, has the highest multi-attribute value, whereby it is the recommended choice. Then we have the final step of sensitivity analysis, and the purpose here is to show how changes in preference statements correspond to changes in the decision recommendations. So assume, for instance, that instead of 0.1 decrease in road fatalities, the tax increase of 0.25 percentage points would be compensated by a decrease of 0.15 road fatalities per year. Now, this change in preference statements would decrease the weight of road fatalities from 67 to 57% and make C, transit and climate push, the preferred choice. On the other hand, assume now that for instance, a decrease of 6 kilotons per year in CO2 emissions would be equally valuable as increasing taxes by only 0.2 percentage points instead of 0.25 percentage points, as opposed to foregoing the tax increase altogether. Now, this change would increase the weight of taxes quite considerably and make program A the most preferred choice. This concludes this small illustrative example of how preference elicitation methods and tools can be used to support difficult decisions involving taboo and tragic trade-offs. But as I'm sure we all know, these kinds of decisions are everywhere in both business and politics. And to ensure the legitimacy of these decisions, it is necessary to make the underlying value judgments explicit. And I must highlight that even if we refuse to make these value judgments explicitly, they are still implied by the choices that we make. Our methods of decision analysis help us debate these value judgments in a transparent way. And I would like to conclude my presentation with a quote from Professor Ralph Keeney, who is a pioneer of multi-criteria decision analysis. And he has said that the only purposeful way that you can influence anything in your life is by your decisions. Everything else just happens beyond your control due to others' decisions or happenstance. So I urge you to stop and think for a moment if you are now facing some decision in your life that requires you to make tragic or taboo trade-offs. And if you are, I hope that this talk has given you some support and tools to really explicitly consider your value judgments and find a purposeful way forward. Thank you very much.